Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Library, hosted tonight at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library, and it is such a pleasure, such a delight to be hosting Moon Charania and Sandeep Bakshi as they discuss Moon's fantastic, truly moving book, Archive of Tongues. This conversation is a part of a larger series called the International Library, which is held in collaboration with the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn and the Center for the Art of Translation in San Francisco. I'll tell you a bit about the series and introduce the library for those who haven't heard of us before, and then I'll turn it over to Leslie Ann and Melanie, who represent these partner institutions. So, about the International Library series, we offer conversations across time, place, and language, hosting authors, translators, and scholars. We celebrate the live diffusion of in-person conversations in the hope of connecting new audiences across land and sea for collective intercultural experiences. These conversations are born out of a curiosity in regards to the practice of translation across languages, cultures, modes of experiences, artistic mediums, and they encourage us to think critically about how stories are generated, told, and mobilized. I'll pass it on over now to my colleague Leslie Ann at the Center for the Art of Translation in San Francisco, who will tell you a bit about her institution.
Hello. Welcome to everyone in Paris. Good evening. Welcome to everyone in New York. Good afternoon, and welcome to those of us joining from the West Coast. Good morning to all of you. As Emily mentioned, I'm Leslie Ann Woofter. I'm the Public Programs Director for the Center for the Art of Translation, based here in San Francisco, California. We're a literary nonprofit that champions literary translation and honors the work of translators. Our publications, events, and educational programming enrich the library of vital literary works, nurture and promote the work of translators, build audiences for literature and translation, and honor the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our schools and our world. You can find out more about our work at catranslation.org.
Thank you for that, Leslie Ann. We'll pass it over to Melanie now, who will introduce the Center for Fiction.
Thank you both so much. Hi, I'm Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here in Brooklyn, New York at the Center for Fiction. We are the only literary nonprofit in the United States that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do this through events like this and partnerships like this, as well as reading groups, writing workshops, a fellowship for emerging writers, a first novel prize, and a kids read program. We're very honored and grateful to participate in this event for this evening, for those of you in Paris, this afternoon, here in Brooklyn, and this morning in San Francisco, where we're all united by cold wind and rain. Thank you so much, everybody, and we're looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you both so much. It's such a pleasure to work with both of these centers and the amazing work that they're doing. So if this is your first time hearing about them, please do look them up online and see the brilliant speakers that they are spotlighting and the work that they're promoting as well. A couple more notes about this conversation. Tonight, this will last for 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from our in-person audience and our Zoom audience, who's inside that camera right there with Leslie Ann and Melanie. Hello. So feel free to send in your questions over Zoom at any point, and if you're in the room, just start thinking about them now. And finally, there are copies of Archive of Tongue that will be for sale after this event that you could get signed as well. So please do consider purchasing it. On to our brilliant speakers tonight. Moon Charania is Associate Professor of International Studies and Comparative Women's Studies at Spelman College. Dr. Charania is a feminist theorist whose research explores the psychosocial dimensions of the lives of women of color, the social, political, and intimate relations in relation to violence and care, gender and sexuality, racism, and the diasporic experience. She is the author of 2 books, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, and Will the Real Pakistani Woman Please Stand Up? Empire, Visual Culture, and the Brown Female Body. Charania is also the recipient of a number of awards and fellowships, and she is beginning a new book project on brownness and femicide. Tonight, Moon, Dr. Charania, is joined by Sandeep Bakshi, who researches transnational, queer, and decolonial enunciations of knowledges. He received his PhD from the School of English University of Leicester, UK, and is currently employed as Associate Professor of Decolonial, Postcolonial, and Queer Studies at Université Paris Cité. He coordinates 2 research seminars, Peripheral Knowledge and Empires, South's Sexualities, and leads the Pôle Société Civile of the Cité du Genre Institute, Université Paris Cité, co-editor of Decolonizing Sexualities, Transnational Perspectives, Critical Interventions, Decolonial Trajectories, a special issue of the interventions, and Qu'est-ce que c'est l'intersectionality, Domination plurielle, Sexe, classe et race. He has published on queer and race problematics in postcolonial literatures and cultures, and he is the co-founder and serves on the board of the Decolonizing Sexualities Network. Moon, Sandeep, it is such a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Can we have a round of applause, please?
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. Thank you, Moon, for being in conversation with me. It is an honor to have you with me here today. Thank you so much for writing the intimate archive of the Brown Maternal and a return to the Brown Maternal that you profess at the end of the book. I'm encouraged by the first anecdote in the book, the anecdote of the tongue. And for the audience, I'd like you to read that anecdote and what follows immediately, if you'd oblige.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. So let me just begin by saying thank you. My warmest gratitude to Emily for hosting me, for working with me for 1 year, trying to coordinate this event, and Emma for the work that she's done in pulling this all together, and Sandeep for being an interlocutor with me. I'm so grateful to have a partner in thought for this evening. So yes, I'll begin by reading a passage that, as Sandeep suggested, I think lays out the arc of the book as well, and also allows the audience to kind of understand why the title is the essence of the title of the book. Yes. So like I said, this is from the introduction. The introduction is called A Story on Tongues. When I was a little girl, my mother used to tell me a story. It was a story she repeated various points throughout my childhood and well into my young adulthood. It was a strange, silly, and over-the-top story. Like many of my mother's stories, this story was abject and centered around flesh. And for a long time, I thought this story was yet another example of my mother's obsession with oppression. But my mother narrated the story with such mysteriousness, with such dailiness, continuity, factuality, steadiness, that I eventually came to hold space for this story in my life, that I eventually realized that my growing was marked by the story. The story was about the tongue. Think about the human tongue, my mother would say. The tongue is soft and vulnerable, fleshy and pink. We need it to eat, to speak. We needed to enjoy food and sex. The tongue is all muscle and no bone, supple. It has a huge range of motion and shape and agility. No matter how much you use it or don't, it never loses its volume. The tongue, she would say, is tirelessly flexible. But this tongue, for all its softness, lives between 32 teeth, hard, strong, dense, and sharp. Any given second, the teeth can damage, tear, wound the tongue. But the tongue has no choice. It must learn to live among the teeth, between and within the hardness that could individually or collectively destroy the tongue. My mother does not remember the origins of this story, unsure if it came from her mother or her grandmother, or a story she strung together from other stories she had heard throughout her life. But every time she offered this story, it was an invitation to think with her about difficulty and violence and unlivability, to think with her about the ways that women are often, as Simone de Beauvoir wrote, imprisoned by the peculiarities of the body. The very idea of the tongue living so intimately with that which can destroy it functions as a necrometaphorization, a metaphor not just of death, but of death worlds, a metaphor of life that is perpetually threatened with or close to death. But just as she inextricably enmeshed the tongue in a field of imminent violences, her story also pointed to the ways the tongue ruptures these possibilities and is instead perpetually surviving, resisting, maneuvering, negotiating, fleeing its oppressive conditions. The tongue, as my mother tells it, insists on and survives through its agility. This private metaphoric story of the tongue's place in the mouth among teeth was one moment when I realized that my mother speaks in tongues. As the primer of my childhood, I now take this story into serious consideration. This strange little story, a play on words, a play on tongues, holds within it what Shayla Sandoval might call a methodology of the oppressed, an alternative consciousness, an oppositional expression. For as long as I can remember, my mother constructed the tongue in this way, as experimental, always tentative, subversive, possibly insubordinate, and unsovereign, never belonging just to itself. For her, the tongue is a troubled condition born in the body, both a closure of flesh in the mouth and a going beyond flesh, language. As a piece of flesh that functions in a structure of constraints, enclosures, governance, and training, the tongue has to survive its own conditions in order to then tell the story of its survival. This story offered a lesson on the non-sovereignty of our bodies, a lesson that violence was not just out in the world, exterior, anterior, posterior, but that violence haunts the very ways our bodies are built. The irony of the body to commit violence against itself, and the ability of the body to survive and thrive, by which I mean to live intentionally, within its own inflicted or imminent violence was not lost on me. Even as a little girl, I realized this story on the tongue undid the common sense of the body taught to me in schools, run by men, in books written by men. Over time, this story became for me an object of theory, an episteme, information, not in the sense of theoretical distillation, but rather as implicitly theoretical in its inquisitive commitments or its descriptive style. I came to see my mother's tongue as having inherited incommensurable ways of knowing the unknowable. Incommensurable because they unraveled conventional modes of empiricism, logic, and comfort. I came to see my mother's tongue as a relation to a condition, a maneuvered sociality, a denied pedagogy. It is a pedagogy that is not pedagogical because it is rife with bad education, feminine insurgency, and indices of failure. It is a pedagogy of how to exist once you accept that oppression is immovable, a social fact of social life. It is a pedagogy that refuses to do what language, in its more colonial guises, is often called on to do. For my mother, tongues are a thingness that is feminized. They are fleshy and vulnerable, even as they are agile and manipulative, just as they too perform a way of being within the mouth and without language. The tongue is given meaning, even saturated with meaning, just as it too is dismissed as meaning nothing. It is the ideological and fleshy site from which one must be severed in order for one to become a subject, the mother in the tongue. That language gets collapsed into tongues and tongues into language is not entirely figurative. It literally invokes the maternal body. As a deeply erotic, intimate, and tenuous apparition, the tongue, like women's bodies, is often regarded as dirty and excessive, particularly in terms of sexuality. My mother's story assembles and fissures this dirty, irreverent, and fugitive femininity, and in so doing gestures to queer sexuality, to dirty sex, to a literal and an appropriately oblique relation to the libidinous. It captures and stays close to immodesty and eroticism, sensation and feeling, language and flesh. In feminizing the tongue, soft flesh surrounded by hardness, my mother signals to femininity as one way into other knowledges, memories, eccentricities, feelings, stories, and socialities. Metaphors for my mother are serious things, so are archives. But the conventional archive, that which evidences the past or past events through text, documents, and materials, was not one with which my mother would have engaged, or for that matter, understood, in part because of the dialectic between access and knowledge, what in Urdu is called talim, and in part, and perhaps more frankly, because she would find it boring. While others built their knowledge by collecting information through rational and regularized processes, my mother, in contrast, pursued means that were oral, irregular, inappropriate, improper, embarrassing, and shameful. She did it sometimes surreptitiously, other times boldly, and other times ordinarily, like cooking, like telling stories. It looked like complacency and cliche and acceptance to the dominant order. I learned to listen closely to what she had to offer me, and I found myself enmeshed in flesh, thick with fissured, fragmented, polyvocal, polysemic, dirty, feminized, maternal vernaculars. The tongue of which my mother speaks and the tongues through which I now write this book are an archive of a feminized world that has been made abject and violated, evaded, or just not dealt with, misogynistically dismissed, reduced to myth, folklore, old wives' tale, illiteracy, catty speech, gossip, riddles, conspiracy theories, and secrets. Her broken, distorted, unfinished, feminized, lyrical, Urdu, Gujarati, Hindi, English vernacular, her ethnicized and gendered tongue pushes at the borderlands of formal knowledge and informal knowledge, of intellectual history and being left out of intellectual history, of useful knowledge and knowledge without use, or not knowledge at all, extraneous, gratuitous, solipsistic. I am now a collector and curator of my mother's tongues, perhaps retrospectively, perhaps nostalgically.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, I must say, when you were talking about the lyrical Urdu, Gujarati, Hindi, English vernacular, and we were talking about the borderlands. Of course, how can I not go back to the original story of the tongue? If ever there can be an original narrative, that becomes a point of departure for the intimate, for the feminist archive. Would you consider this Ansel Dua's serpent's tongue, which you reference, of course, in the notes, the lesbian tongue, that which works its way through language? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sandeep, for that. Yes, Gloria Anzaldúa, this bridge called My Back, canonical work in feminist studies, particularly women of color feminisms, is foundational to my own training. She becomes a kind of haunting throughout the book, the work that she's done, the kind of that feminist genealogy of the 70s and 80s that really relied on a turning towards the mother, turning towards the home, kinship, community, the domestic, that we saw, I think, in later, late 80s, 90s, a kind of turning away from the home and to the exterior structures, the university, politics, whatnot. But what I'll say is I'll quote Gloria Anzaldúa, who I think, has this really lovely quote that drove me to really think about tongues and why I stayed, why tongues becomes a kind of centerpiece of the book, as Anzaldúa once wrote, that queer women of color speak in tongues like the outcast and the insane. This is one of her quotes that I think really resonates with what I was trying to think about with my mother, who mobilizes this story throughout my upbringing as a way to, as a warning, as a pedagogy, but it's a pedagogy that's deeply feminized and thus not seen as a pedagogy. And it's also a pedagogy that's very queer because it centers flesh, it centers excess, it thinks in very uncomfortable ways about sovereignty, and it actually refuses the idea that the body in of itself is a sovereign subject, in particular the gendered subject as non-sovereign. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'll push it a little further. So I was thinking about your work belongs to a rich and developing body of literature on the feminist archive in the field of intimate historical writing that was inaugurated in certain ways by Hazel Carby, on imperial intimacies, which appeared in 2019, where non-standard modes of archiving emerge. It appears that the mobilization of memory strengthens the intimate archive, as Carby would say. And so your work also belongs to that category. So I'd like to commence with the instability of memory of memory as archive, and how you consider the archive of the dispossessed, in particular, as holding on to this instability. I think you've just read an extract where you mentioned methodology of the oppressed. So this conceptualization through Sandoval, through Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And so is there a way of thinking this methodology as one that is always unstable? Since it evokes memory as a repository of transgenerational, diasporic, violence as such, domesticity, and intimate feminized space and time. So what emerges into view in terms of, say, sensing and knowing, if I can use the vocabulary of decolonial thinking? I don't know if I'm clear.
Absolutely. Yes. First of all, thank you for finding some symmetry between my work and Hazel Carby, who again is a teacher, a mentor, and very influenced by her work, particularly what she's doing in Imperial Intimacies. I think one of the things what we see happening in Carby that she's doing in that particular book, but what we see a kind of movement, I think, among women and queer of color writing, particularly over the last maybe say 10, 15, maybe 10, probably not 15 years, is a kind of movement towards this unstable thought, kind of moving towards that which is illegible. The question is what is the proper object of archival study? And it's often not memory, because memory is, and I do, and the book really engages very heavily with psychoanalysis, is memory is actually a maligned form. Memory, repetition, these are very maligned forms of, these are psychically maligned aspects in psychoanalysis. So to rely on feminine memory, maternal memory, embodied knowledge, is this something that we can call an archive? So one of the reasons I think, I remember when the book was originally titled something else, I was thinking learning my mother's tongues, because there's so much part of the book relies on this exchange, this mother-daughter dyad. But I had a friend many years ago, as I was writing in the early stages, who after hearing this story on Archive of Tongues said to me that this is an archive of tongues. And I thought, this is an archive of flesh. It's an archive of feminine and feminized knowledges, and knowledges that are seen as feminine, feminized, and racialized, and thus very approximate to queerness, illegibility, illegitimacy. And I wanted to think about what it means to bring those together, to curate them as an actual site of feminist pedagogy, as a site of theorization, right? If we think of theorizing in Stuart Hall's conceptualization, that theory is one way to access the unknown,
Thank you for that generous response. So let's continue with the book, and I'd now like to turn to how you conceptualize brown male patriarchy, brown patriarchy, and how that articulates in relation to the brown maternal, choking it through its proximity to what you term as the white supremacist cultural logic, as you mentioned. So could I request that you relate to us the anecdote or the incident which you highlight somewhere around pages 75 and 80 on your father's white children? So that entire anecdote about how patriarchy is not just a way of organizing, but also a space of intimate violence that it enacts within the family, within the domesticity of the intimacy of the family. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. So just for folks who haven't read the book, so the book does trace my mother's life. And so in that regard, it really kind of flirts, if you will, with multiple genres. There's memoir, there's biography, there's, as I mentioned, a relation to theory, particularly decolonial thought, women of color, feminism, psychoanalysis. But in tracing my mother's life, and one of the things I say is there's no way I could have written my mother's life without writing to my father's life. And I had to think about, or I wanted, I think, as a feminist theorist, to really think about how the father line and the figure of the father serves as a kind of interruption to women's storytelling. And as I had actually mentioned to Sandeep earlier, that, you know, one of a dear friend of mine who's a Black feminist poet in the South once said to me that after reading the book said, you know, your book took me back to a space, to a time where women actually spoke to each other. And so there's the section I'm going to read is alluding to my mother's relation to my father, who in the 1960s, upon arrival in the US, very quickly fell in love and married a young white girl. He too was a young college student. And they very quickly, within the span of 9 years, had 5 children, and the marriage also quickly ended. So just to give you a little bit of background, it's a bit reductive, but just to give you some context into what I'm about to read. And his first wife was institutionalized shortly thereafter in the 70s, and my mother, at various points in her life, raised these children who she often referred to as my father's white children. So she never quite accepted the brownness of these children. And so I really, again, as someone who thinks about race and racial formations, I wanted to understand what was happening, how whiteness was a disturbing encounter for a brown diasporic mother. So the section I'm going to read begins with a quote by Fred Moten: "Suffer with me tonight in my native hue." My father's children returned to live with us sporadically through the 1980s and the 1990s. Each arrival was shaped by either the threat of violence or the event itself. My mother was convinced they were untrustworthy. She had been set up to take the fall for their actions not once, not twice, not thrice, but time and again. She was sure they held a deep resentment towards her specifically, and us children more generally. And to a certain extent, she fully understood the emotional ecologies of why. But in those days, she didn't know the word racism. She would just say, "These kids don't like our color." She was full of conspiracy theories. She was convinced that these children saw her as a domestic and domesticated fool. Her ease in the kitchen, her song-like tongue, her seamless brown femininity impressed in others that she was docile, dumb, defenseless, thus easy to take advantage of, to be made a fool. "Be careful," she would warn me, her gaze always on the lookout. Theirs, she would caution, was a forked tongue, which I came to understand as different from what she called a sharp tongue. Forked tongues were duplicitous and disloyal, even if they were likable. They were disingenuous in their very loquaciousness, and loquacious these kids were. Sharp tongues, conversely, were a feminine mode of survival. Sharpening soft flesh was one way flesh and femininity could be secretly disobedient. Miti churi, she called this, which translated as sweet knife. The constant and concealed furtive practices that she developed were revealed only to a few. This, for her, was a simple fact. There was a world of difference between duplicity and disobedience. And so, with the arrival of the white children, she became more vigilant, cognizant, alert, peering out from the corner of her eye, making sure she didn't miss anything. Their difference was a threat. She didn't trust them, but she also pitied them. Abandoned by their mother, only occasionally raised by my father, trained to hate brown people by their maternal family, yet themselves colored by my father, unclear borders, ambiguous belongings. Their own mother, my father's first wife, was never overtly mentioned, But it was an open secret that Jay, shortly after the birth of her 5th child and their divorce, lived much of her life institutionalized, and that she eventually died painfully of uterine cancer. Shortly after we had settled in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, my father received a letter from his oldest daughter saying that their mother had been checked into a psychiatric institution. Social services had arrived at their home in Alpena and had called him, suggesting he take full custody of all 5 kids. But my father reasoned that Jay wouldn't want to come back to an empty house. So he took custody of 3, the youngest son, one of the twin boys, and the oldest son. He thought his oldest daughter could care for her younger brother, neither of them home alone, nor Jay's house empty. After a few months, Jay was released and convinced her sons to steal money from their father and return to her. That moment in which their theft was folded into violence against my mother, in which she came to understand that violence in her life was sprawling and vast and included other male actors, tethered my mother even more seriously and secretively to her furtive maneuvers of survival. In practicality then, my mother had no control when the children came to stay with us. My father made that decision, and in a particularly methodical order. First, he would receive several mechanical letters from each of the kids requesting to visit. The letters, especially from his sons, were often just a few sentences, sometimes even just one sentence, repeated 2 or 3 times. The repetition of the letters and the poor writing would trigger my father's guilt at abandoning his kids. How could his English writing and speaking skills be better than that of his white children? He would respond by telling them to come as soon as their mother arrived. The letters came. My father arranged travel. My mother bartered time. But truth be told, my father didn't always arrange travel. Their mother didn't always grant permission, and my mother didn't always have time. Many times the kids, sometimes collectively and other times individually, would hitchhike from Alpena to Atlanta, getting rides from random strangers to get away from their volatile and erratic mother, and to come to live with their estranged father. A loud knock on the door and the sociality of my mother's home transmogrified, and once they arrived, it was clear that my father's residual anxiety at having lived through his marriage to Jay and his liberal hunger for self-improvement would effectively motivate the firmness he took with my mother and the laissez-faire approach he took with them. When the children came, they took over the house. They spoke loudly, laughed loudly, took up space loudly. Their comfort was her discomfort. Unlike her small frame and the smallness of her younger children, these children were big-boned, big-bodied, big-voiced, big-personalitied. So their sociality was her silence. But it was still my mother who dealt with their schedules, talked with them, advised them, and prepared food for them. She was generous, just as she was reserved and reluctant. These kids were dependent upon my mom's labor to consolidate and to support them and their relation to our brown immigrant world, which included everyday practices like food, prayer, trips to Kmart, thrift stores, Jamaat Khana, which is a name for a mosque, extended family, and the minute-by-minute language translation. To them, our language was fun and funny, accessible, enjoyable, humorous, and easily forgotten. But if culture could be fetishized and enjoyed as a collection of objects, food, clothing, language, religion, conversely, was serious and inflexible. And in this way, my father wanted his children completely inculcated. We prayed every evening as a family, sitting in a circle on the carpeted floor, Arabic prayers rolling off of our tongues, undulating and inflecting in unison, hanging in the air, blessing, so said my father, our home. When my father's white children lived with us, they were expected to participate in this evening ritual. If their visit coincided with Ramadan, they were expected to fast. And when we went to the mosque on Fridays, they were expected to join. My father's expectations of religious commitment were nothing short of unrealistic for us or for them. There were times they tried to resist my father's religious dogma. They were Christian, they said, not Muslim. White Americans, they said, not brown immigrants. On this, my mother commiserated with them. Through no fault of their own, they were awkward, self-conscious, tongue-tied. Their race privilege rested on the gesture of distancing themselves from his religious racial identity. The paternal demand to be Muslim negatively interfaced with the loyalty they had to the father line. It produced a strain, an antagonism. This friction with the father meant a turning towards my mother, and in her they would confine the complicated range of feelings, loyalties, confusions that suffused their experience in our home. Their disorientation demanded her racialized and feminine consolation. And in the space of that solace, perhaps they too came to care for her. In these rare moments, my brother, sister, and I would stand outside the room when this happened, lined up against the faded cream wall of our middle-class suburban home, eavesdropping, the gulf between us and them exaggerated by the structure of a physical division and the secrets that appeared to be dispensed on the other side. What I could make out in the conversation was how my mother, despite her disaffection, was somehow sensitized to their emotions. I had repeatedly seen her disaffection, which I understood as an index of her ambivalence, her discomfort, her dissonance, her negativity. So when their affection loosened my mother in the way that love loosens the body, she tightened up, pushed back, gathered the three of us, and poured on us all the love the other children had let loose in her. She deliciously fussed over us, and we enjoyed every second of it. She saved her love for the three of us in a way that was electric. I came to be fascinated with how my mother held on to the negativity of their whiteness. The ordinary ease with which she reiterated white as other, the casualness with which she dismantled the infinite specificity of whiteness was nothing short of mesmerizing. I came to accept this as a fact, even as this was disputed by my father and his family, for whom it was simply about the fact of patrilinearity, or more simply, science. But my mother, accustomed to falling out of the brackets of legibility, was not interested in either the men or the science. To her, these children were not her creation. They did not contain her history. Shared sperm did not make them siblings. She would search in vain for any reflection of herself and would return to herself empty, void of any connection, except the occasional pity contoured by the fact of whiteness. The fact of their whiteness. Whiteness was not a detail to be passed over. Whiteness betrays, it controls, it unravels our cohesiveness. It is the outside that sees no border of entry. Whiteness can always come inside.
I was thinking about the intimate economy of brown families and how whiteness is always outside in the global north. And what happens when that domestic space, which is free of whiteness, is actually whiteness intervenes into that space. And that's I think this episode recounts really how your mother and the family accepts this whiteness as well, as just a science, as your father would say. And so I just now, I think we'd like to wrap up so that we have time also for the question from the audience. So one last thing that I'd like to consider is the severance from desire, right? In terms of lesbianism, in terms of queerness, and how in your book it really comes across as something which follows from a genealogy of queer of color critique and decolonial queer, and this the severance of sexuality from desire, as you elaborate in one of the last chapters, Promiscuous Tongues, is a potent point that points to the failures of global North lesbian and feminist narratives, which are always almost suited to desire. Right, this non-legibility of lesbianism might become difficult to comprehend, as we know that your mother does not name your lesbian partner, but as friend, right? So would you like to comment on the brown lesbian and its circulation, articulation in brown worlds that does not necessarily reference global North conceptions of sexual desire, but has its own way of making paths into queerness in a way? Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Yes, I'll just speak very briefly to, what I was trying to do in this particular section, as you pointed out, is I wanted to complicate the idea that one of the things we've seen in so much critical race work is that there's this kind of sacrosanct space of the black and brown home, or the home of the immigrant, and whiteness is this encounter that happens exteriorly once you depart from the structure of the home. And I wanted to complicate that, and it's something that we've seen in a lot of Black studies, that there really is no pure brownness or pure Blackness if we really take the colonial legacy seriously, as we should. And I wanted to think about what that meant when we understand that kind of that really kind of cross-pollution, cross-fertilization. Sorry, that wasn't on. Could people hear me? Yes, okay. And I think Claudia Rankine has a great, I'll just reference her really quickly and then move to the lesbian section. But after the film, the very well-known film, Jordan Peele's film Get Out, that was, got a lot of traction, excellent film. But one of the things she says, as someone who has a interracial family, is she says, we actually can't get out. We're all in it. So we need to figure out what it means to be in the inside of this very messy, in this kind of very messy, complicated, complex minefield of race and racial formations that have these violent colonial legacies and that get enacted and practiced in various ways in our intimate lives. So I'll just say that, and then to turn to queerness and lesbianism, and as the book proceeds, the next chapter after this chapter is called Promiscuous Tongues, and I open with a story of my mother's first love, if you will. I certainly look at it that way, so I'll read that section, perhaps, and then... So this section opens with, I think, a very amazing Jean Genet quote, "I can't say anything but lies." When my mother was 10 years old, her family moved to Peshawar, where they lived in a large estate house, formerly one of the residences of the English. Close to the Afghanistan border, my mother describes Peshawar as a devout Muslim city, rural, religious, and conservative. It was 1956. Shortly after the move, my mother got her first period, which in 1950s Northwest Pakistan brought with it the expectation of wearing the burqa. Careless and carefree, however, she often forgot to oblige. And since they had arrived from the urban center of Karachi, no one in her family really enforced it. Their driver, however, a sweet Peshawari man in his 40s, was uncomfortable with my mother's noticeable pre-adolescent femininity and with my grandmother's laissez-faire approach to covering, and he began keeping a collection of burqas in the car for the forgetful young Karachi girls. This was not Karachi, he would gently remind my mother and her older sister. One day, the driver arrived at their home with a young teenage girl. Offering a rushed and blunt explanation, he introduced 13-year-old Jamila. Whom he called ugly and unmarriageable. She was the only daughter in the family and desperately needed work. After this explanation, he awkwardly scurried off, leaving Jamila at the doorstep. My grandmother, who believed the right age for marriage was significantly older than 13, and with an eye towards preserving the young girl's respectability, told Jamila to grab her bag and move in. She would help around the house and stay in the room with the girls. My mother quickly came to be infatuated with Jamila. As my mother describes her, she was tall for her age, had light brown coloring, thick braided hair, a quiet face with dark spots from old and new acne, and deep, large eyes. Bewildered by the description of her as ugly and unmarriageable, my mother conversely thought Jamila lovely and companionable. The girls quickly became fast friends. Each day, when she returned home from school, my mother, normally disdainful of housework, enthusiastically joined Jamila in her household chores. Jamila, too, would strategically save the collaborative work, such as folding laundry or making rotis for the afternoon, so that the girls could work together. Meanwhile, in every passing minute she spent with Jamila, my mother's intimacy intensified. and she began working up the courage to confess her own small, controversial secret. Jamila had been with their family for 4 months when my mother decided she could no longer hold in her secret. Both girls were folding clothes in the bedroom, the air heavy with trepidation. My mother reached over and hugged Jamila. The girls had a friendly, affectionate friendship, so Jamila returned the hug, kissed my mother on the cheek, then turned back to the clothes. My mother further implored her, hesitant, childlike, curious. Her affection was growing toward Jamila, whose body my mother intriguingly saw as more womanly than her own. She kissed Jamila on her lips. Affection for my mother softened Jamila's reaction, and for a moment the girls lingered in not one, not two, but 3 warm, secret, shameful, and delicious kisses. The rumblings of desire brewed slowly but never materialized. Jamila's sense quickly shifted. She recoiled. Seething, shocked, she declared this was wrong, a sin, against Islam, and despite my mother's stammering, shame-filled pleas for forgiveness, Jamila stated that she would have to tell her mother. The warmth between the girls had gone cold. Filled with fear, my mother watched Jamila leave the room and head towards the kitchen. In a moment of quick impulse, my mother rushed back to her mother before Jamila could, and with an absolute straight face told her that Jamila tried to touch her. As quickly as the words came out of my mother's mouth, she regretted them. But it was too late. Jamila was immediately rushed out of the house and sent back to her family. Jamila begged my grandmother not to make her leave, saying that she desperately needed this work, that she didn't do anything, that she was the only person working in her family. But my grandmother, filled with the anxiety my mother had planted, sat Jamila in the back seat of the car and ordered the driver to take her back. The damage had been done. My grandmother and mother never spoke of Jamila again. No men were brought into the secret. But my mother, who later in life would become a stellar liar, had at the age of 10 told her first and most damaging lie, and ruined, as she tells it now, Jamila's life and future forever. 6 decades later, this story achieved, as many of my mother's stories do, mythic and mystic proportions. I was sitting with my mother, and we were discussing the concept of nazar, which loosely translates as gaze, and which is often used as the Urdu shorthand for the concept of the evil eye. My mother's belief in the evil eye is greater than any other of her religious or spiritual beliefs. To her, the evil eye, nazar lag jayegi, is both a powerful otherworldly force and one that can produce intergenerational inheritance, such as leen-deen, another complicated Urdu expression that also alludes to inheritance. It must be deterred. But she said to me that day, taking a small detour, sometimes in rare moments, the nazar cannot be deterred. It is instead deserved. It is what you get for what you do. She began recounting the story, full of pith and moment, a childhood crush, a shared erotic moment, a moral rejection, an intense fear, all crusted over by a single but treacherous lie. By her own description, she was not innocent. She tells me, "It never occurred to me that Jamila might not be able to get work after that in the smallness of 1950s Peshawar, news of Jamila's sexual trouble would spread swiftly, that my mother, who was much more tender than any of the other women and the men in my family, would throw Jamila out. I never saw Jamila again. But when you told me you are a lesbian, it confirmed what I have always known about what happened between me and Jamila. I knew she had cursed me, given me the nazar, and rightly so. I twisted her rejection of my desire into a false accusation that ruined her life, and Jamila cursed my blood with the lineage of lesbianism." 60 years after my mother and Jamila kissed, and my mother grafted a lie onto Jamila's character that resulted in, at a minimum, her losing a job, she became the figure through whom the crime of lesbianism was established in our blood. Jamila's fading silhouette became the placeholder for my lesbianism, the cause and punishment of my mother's wayward desire now running through my lesbian body. The pain and yearning inherent in my mother's desire and the shame of how Jamila was punished because of her outright lie moved my mother's understanding of lesbian sexuality from the material, desire as bodily, to the metaphorical, desire as symbol, to the mythic, desire as curse. For my mother, desire became something to bear, and the difficulty of bearing desire meant subsuming it into a deep interiority, unconnected to an outside, an exteriority. My mother's destructive lie was an antidote to her fear, and the bitter taste of both still scoured her tongue. Her desire for Jamila disturbed the order of things. Her sexual disorientation produced social reorientation. She had to make her desire, thus Jamila, strange. Sarah Ahmed once wrote, "Being a girl that wanted a girl troubled my mother, and the designation girl was already trouble. If women are already trouble, being a lesbian troubles trouble, double trouble, or at least more trouble." So the best outlet for the trouble of desire, for the stickiness of memory, for the fleeting moment of lesbianism is mysticism. Held together by longing, fear, betrayal, disappointment, secrets, and lies, my mother layered her non-innocence with the mysticism of magic and blood. And in so doing, she literalized class precarity as having the power to contaminate our maternal line. I realized in my mother's shamed retelling of the story that lesbian desire is a spectral presence at work in my mother's archive. Lesbian desire as apparitional, melancholic, mythopoetical. The notion of pernicious feminine desire held and moved with a rhythm, lucid and obscure, pastoral and futural, an inevitable lie and an archived haunting that could not be transcended. I think my mother's recourse to magic and to blood is a means to name and understand my lesbianism as both anathema and inevitable, intimate and strange, foreign and familial. My mother's guilt and sorrow at hurting Jamila transmogrified class suffering and sexual deviance into magic, a kind of witchery, into a touch across time. Her matter-of-fact statement, "You are a lesbian because Jamila cursed me," her curse avenged my injury to her by transforming my lesbian desire for her into my daughter's lesbian inheritance. Desire as inheritance, desire transferred through time, desire stolen across time. I now think of Jamila as my lesbian ghost, my mother's first crush, my mother's first destruction. Maybe she told me the story to heal. Maybe I excavated a wound. Maybe I am the wound.
Thank you so much for this very, very poetic ending to the lesbian episode in the book. I will stop here. I will leave you now with Moon if you have questions or, yeah.
Yes, so we're going to open this discussion up now to questions from our in-person audience first, and then we'll see if our Zoom audience perhaps has some questions as well. So raise your hand very high, and we will bring you the microphone. Yes.
Hello. I just wanted to say thank you for saying everything you just said, and also the parts you read really touched me, because I'm working on a character who is brown, and he sees the man in the mirror as a different person because he's surrounded by people who are not brown. And what you said about brown not being one thing is very powerful to me, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Good luck with your writing and your project. And you know, one of the tasks of the book was to really complicate how we think about brown as a racial formation. I think Jose Munoz does this really well, right? That brown is not black, it's not white, but it doesn't quite just sit in the middle between both of them. It is far more capacious and complex and messy, and I think we need more and more people to kind of think with this messy terrain. Best of luck.
Other questions in the room?
Okay, thank you very much for being here. I'm presenting your work. It's very appreciated, and I particularly wanted to ask a question about gays. So it was very interesting how you subverted expectations of the gays when your own mother had ideas about whiteness and what they meant. And it is quite clear that the gays could extend to any type of external representations that we see in other people, different from us in all sorts of ways, essentially. Now, pedagogy is also one of the aspects that you have, that you're concerned with. So my question would be, it seems like the female gaze is trying to emerge to a certain extent through feminism. And I do find that very important as obviously a juxtaposition to the male gaze, and as I said, to as a portrayal of any kind of person and individuality. At the same time, precisely by virtue of trying to emphasize one's individuality beyond one's collective representation, wouldn't it be desirable to one day abolish gaze, whatever that may be?
Thank you for that question. Indeed, I think the gaze that I am deploying in the book is that of a lesbian feminist daughter looking at her mother, and I think that's a gaze that, and you know, in part, I wanted to center that because the maternal body, the abject maternal body, the maternal body writ large, is often a kind of body that's loathed. It's not a body that is desired. It is a body that is made abject. It's a body that's often seen as grotesque. To look at one's mother or the maternal figure, particularly when that is a racialized mother, is frowned upon. It is a site of disgust, and I really wanted to flip that and think, what would it look like to actually write about the mother with desire, with understanding, with capaciousness, and use that as an opening. As for abolishing the gaze, yes, do we need alternative gazes? Yes, feminist, lesbian, feminine, queer, trans, all of those. But I don't know, I'm not a visionary, so I don't know if we can actually, I don't know how to envision a world in which how we look at something is not shaped by the kind of, not just our individual subjectivity and this idea of individuation, but more so by histories of colonialism and violence and patriarchy. So that is perhaps a question for a writer who may be in the genre of science fiction. But I don't know that world. As a feminist theorist, as a feminist writer, the gaze that can be complicated, that can be opened up, that can be rendered capacious, and look at that which is otherwise not looked at is where my work lies.
We have time for one final question. Please don't be shy. This is your moment. Otherwise, I get to ask the question. That's really boring, because I work here. I get to ask questions all the time. All right, well, I'll steal it then. You've mentioned before the project that you're currently working on deals with the subject of femicide, and you were telling me that there seems to be a sort of aversion to that term and to specifically voicing violence against women through the lens of femicide as opposed to gender violence. Could you speak more to the role of sort of language in the project that you're shaping now, and what you might be trying to do to combat that?
Yeah, absolutely, Emily. Thank you for that question. So one of the key thematics in the book, even as the book centers in terms of genre, storytelling, memory, and a kind of poetics, a lyricism, one of the key thematics remains to be femininity. And I really want to think about why femininity is so easily rendered abject, violable. So necropolitics, violence against women, is also something that hovers over this text. And I was actually just sharing with Emily a bit earlier that I'm now working on another project which looks at interracial violence, and femicide specifically. And what I've been finding as I am shopping the project and proposing the project to different folks, different publishers, whatnot, is that there's an aversion in the global north to the word femicide. And the language that we've kind of become accustomed to is, or that we've digested, is violence against women, that particular phrase, or the phrase gendered violence. But when we say femicide, unlike in Latin America, where the word feminicide circulates and is actually becoming embedded in legal vernaculars in different countries, there's a kind of aversion to that language. And I'm very curious about what's happening linguistically with the word femicide that makes people so uncomfortable. And I would propose, as having written this project, this book, that there's something about femininity that makes people uncomfortable, that we still haven't come to a point, regardless of whatever feminist progress we might think we've made, that there's something about femininity that remains to be very quickly proximitous to flesh and enfleshment and the body in a way that is seen as anti-intellectual, not rational, illegible, and thus uncomfortable, destabilizing, disorienting. And I do take on some of those ideas in this book, but I really want to center it in my next project in thinking about interracial violence in brown communities.
Can we have a final round of applause, please, for Moon? This was truly so special to hear tonight. Thank you so much for the beautiful readings. Sandeep unfortunately had to run off to catch a train, but we thank him in his absence as well for beautifully moderating this conversation. And thank you as well to the Center for Fiction and the Center for the Art of Translation for partnering with us on this event and for their ongoing creative contributions to the series of the International Library. It's such a pleasure, such a privilege to be able to spotlight voices, modes of thinking, approaches to language, such as Moon's. So thank you so much again. If this was your first time at the library tonight, please don't hesitate to take a look at our programming calendar and see other upcoming events that we have as well. I wish you all a lovely spring evening, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.